Sure. Well, thank you, Danielle, and thank you for having me on this panel. I'm pleased to be with Sara on this. So I always tell my students when I'm teaching about Zionism that there isn't one Zionism, there are many Zionisms, and there have been historically, obviously, many different varieties of Zionism. And so people who identify as Zionists may believe all sorts of different things. There are many different kinds of Zionists. I think fundamentally, if I was to try and distill Zionism into kind of a single sentence, it would be that a Zionist is someone who supports the existence of a Jewish state in the land of Israel. That's essentially what I think Zionism has become, a focus on political Zionism, the idea of Jewish statehood in particular in the land of Israel. So for someone in the United States, American Zionism has always been different from both European Zionism and Israeli Zionism. I think for an American Jew, at least, to be a Zionist is to support Israel's continued existence as a Jewish state, essentially. There's not necessarily agreement on the borders of that state or how Israel's Jewishness should be expressed, but fundamentally, the commitment to Israel's survival and future as a Jewish state, I think, is what really defines Zionism for American Jews. But that doesn't, as you mentioned in your question, that doesn't entail
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Sara, do you have anything to add to that? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I'm so used to, talking as a professor that I actually mute myself if I forget to, take myself offline. Thank you for having me, and I'm so glad that we're all here to join in this conversation. I guess the only thing that I would add is that as we, creep closer and closer to the present day, in addition to, as Dov mentioned, the ideas of Zionism being movement of self-determination or even a place of refuge for the Jewish people. It used to be that Zionism was thought of as the national liberation movement to the Jewish people, but I think that idea or that notion of Zionism has declined significantly as we've entered the age of identity politics, and Zionism no longer looks like some kind of form of radical liberation, and instead has been translated into something more akin to oppression. And I think we'll have a chance to talk about that, how this transition happens in the post-1967 period.
Do you think you could elaborate on that a little bit before we move into our next question?
Sure. Well, actually, I saw that, our next questions are really going to be about sort of how has American Zionism evolved over the past 50 years or so. And in a shameless, plug for my new book project, which I'm calling New Day in Babylon and Jerusalem, Zionism, Jewish Power, and Identity Politics. Sorry, I had to get that in there, kids. I think that what we're really trying to understand is what has happened to this unanimity that Marshall Scolaire noted around the time of the 1967 war, that 99% of American Jewry stood in solidarity with Israel. And something clearly has changed over the past 50 years, because I think if we were even going to poll this audience, I'm not sure that we would find 99% of us being able to agree with that statement, or at least, without some kind of qualification. So I guess we're trying to trace what's happened. And I'll suggest a couple of different explanations. The first, of course, is the, increasing question of alignment between Israel's behaviors and American Jewish values. Something has changed over the past 50 years, and that, and as Israel increasingly has taken on wars of choice, say in 1982 with the Israel-Lebanon war, or the collapse of the Oslo peace process, or the Second Intifada and its aftermath, and what we continue to see is this sort of endless cycle of violence. There's been, there's just different priorities between Israelis and Americans, and the different question of values and vocabulary to express those values that has seen that unanimity unravel significantly. And I think that is something that we're talking quite a lot about right now, is especially in the post-COVID period, where the two nations have essentially been completely separated. and on their own trajectories because of the inability to travel, the inability to visit. What will that reality look like going forward, where these two parallel lines of American Jewry and Israeli Jewry and American Zionism and Israeli Zionism ever really be able to cross ever again? I think that's one outstanding question. So you have the question of sort of these different alignments, but I think that there's also the other explanations would really be about that demography is destiny. We're looking at how the demography of the American Jewish community has changed significantly since the period of the 1960s. You can see the latest Pew survey of American Jews that not only notes that American Jews are becoming more diverse racially and ethnically, but also that those who affiliate most strongly with the Zionist movement and really are, in a sense, going to be the Sherit Yisrael, sort of the vanguard of the Jewish people, because of rates of intermarriage, because of rates of Jewish education, because of the increasing, different attitudes between millennials and older generations. You can see this at every family dinner table, that the grandparents and the grandchildren don't necessarily see eye to eye, that we're heading into a different reality. And this is exacerbated by denominational differences as well, that it seems that modern Orthodox, and especially the Haredim, who will be the future of American Jewry by 2050. I mean, if you look at the demographic charts, just by nature of in marriage and reproductive rate, the Haredim are going to be the future of American Judaism, whether that's a movement that we subscribe to or not, but ultra-Orthodoxy is going to be an extremely important aspect of where the evolution and the trajectory of American Zionism is going, as well as the, I think, relative stability of the minority of modern Orthodox Jewry that comprise something of 10% of American Jewry. And, given the trajectory that we're on, Reform and conservative Judaism, or what I would call liberal and progressive Judaism, really on the decline, where more conservative and observant elements of American Judaism and consequently American Zionism are on the rise for our trajectory for the future.
Thank you so much, Sara. You really led into our second question, but I'll pose it again. And, Dov, please jump in. In recent years, Zionism and Israel have become increasingly contested in both the larger political discourse and within American Jewish community. Could you talk to us a little bit about that evolution from your standpoint as well?
Sure. Yeah. So, Sarah already mentioned some of the factors that I think have been responsible for this shift within the American Jewish community. I think it's a shift that's been taking place much longer than just the last few years. I think the last few years it's become really apparent, and the kind of generational conflicts over Israel, the political conflicts over Israel have, dominated much of the American Jewish conversation in recent years. But I actually think that the shift started really going back to, as Sara mentioned, the invasion of Lebanon, the first war in Lebanon, through the Intifada. So this is a long-term process. And I think it's really, as I've argued, that it's not so much that American Jews are abandoning Israel or distancing themselves from Israel, as some have claimed, but rather they're expressing their attachment to Israel in a different way, that it no longer consists of kind of unconditional support for Israel, right or wrong, but increasingly is expressing itself through a kind of more critical engagement with the country. So I think that is taking place. On the one hand, that you're having much more open questioning and challenging of Israeli government policies and actions, debate over those policies, disagreement and protest. But that protest isn't necessarily an expression of opposition to Israel so much as concern for Israel. That said, I think what we're seeing in the last few years is a shift whereby it's not just Israel's policies towards the Palestinians, the future of the West Bank, the peace process, etc., or let's say the occupation, that's the issue for American Jews, but increasingly Israel's very identity as a Jewish state. And I think there is now a growing discussion about Zionism itself and the legitimacy of Zionism and the justification for Israel as a Jewish state, and whether Israel can be both a Jewish state and a democracy, whether it can treat its Palestinian minority fairly and equally. I think these are questions are growing. So we're seeing this shift. And I think the kind of Zionist consensus, if you like, that emerged actually rather late in American Jewish history, not really until after 1967, as Sara was mentioning. I think that Zionist consensus is beginning to unravel. And we're seeing the rise, or I should say the return, of non-Zionism and anti-Zionism, which were in many ways the norm before Israel's establishment. I mean, if we start the clock earlier, you know, in many ways, American Jews returning back to an earlier period when Zionism was one of a number of Jewish ideologies or forms of politics competing for the loyalties of American Jews. And I think that shift is taking place where Zionism is no longer unchallenged as the civil religion of American Jewry.
That's really interesting. Do you think you could expand upon that a little in turn? Perhaps it's a bit of a simplistic question, but what would be the other options? You mentioned there are 3 options for American Jewry. I'm sorry, I forgot the wording that you used, but you know, you said Zionism, and then you said there were other options for what American Jews might have thought was the answer for the, you know, the Jewish question.
Well, I mean, historically, you know, there have been many, many different alternatives offered. And I don't really see much in the way of kind of a coherent alternative to Zionism in the way that existed in European Jewish politics before Israel's establishment. But you can identify kind of diasporism emerging, whereby you know, it challenges the centrality of Israel in American Jewish life. It argues that maybe the whole project of Jewish statehood was a mistake, or at least is no longer necessary, and that you know, American Jews really should focus their energies on here, in the United States, and on creating a kind of thriving and inclusive Jewish community and an American Judaism that is less dependent upon a support for Israel and identification with Israel. That Israel has been the central element in American Jewish identity and American Judaism for the last since 1967 at least. And it's really questioning that in the name of a kind of broad diasporism, and also you might say anti-Zionism in some cases. And that is also associated with obviously sympathy and support for the Palestinians. So the other shift which is happening, I think, in the United States isn't just this kind of rise of challenges to Zionism within the American Jewish community, but also a broader challenge to Zionism within American society at large. And we're seeing now, you know, growing numbers of Americans who have always been very sympathetic to Zionism, increasingly questioning Zionism itself, not just Israel's actions in the West Bank or Gaza, but the very idea of a Jewish state.
Thank you so much for expanding on that. Can you anticipate what American Zionism will look like going forward, and how it will change? Sara, we'll begin with you.
Yeah, first I wanted to respond, you know, sort of to work this all in together, to respond a little bit to, you know, what Dov says about, you know, other forms of Jewish politics also emerging in the United States, and the possibilities thereof, which, you know, where Zionism, if, you know, not necessarily anti-Zionism, but also at least ones where Zionism is not centered as part of American identity. I guess the questions raised by this, though, is how will the rising tide of anti-Semitism in the United States over the last few years, and also more generally, how you know, the rising tide of anti-Semitism calling into question whether America truly is different from other Jewish diasporas impact the future of this diasporic model. If you believe that America is different, then the diasporic model that Dov has suggested has become one possible Jewish politics alternative seems appealing to people. But if you don't believe that America is different, and you believe that, you know, ultimately the fate of America may be the same as other European diasporas, or at very least that anti-Semitism will not abate, then I guess people would say Zionism remains the answer, because going back to that old definition of Zionism that we were talking about, that, you know, hasn't been so relevant for American Jews for most of their history, may increasingly become so. This idea that Zionism, or the state of Israel, is a place of refuge from anti-Semitism, from, as Danielle put it, the Jewish question. Though of course we know that Israel itself didn't solve the Jewish question, because Jews themselves are, you know, continue to be under threat within the state of Israel as well as anywhere else, perhaps more so there than in the diaspora. But as towards sort of what the future may look like, with those caveats of this uncertainty about what anti-Semitism will mean for American Jews and what their continued safety and prosperity will look like in this country, I think the trajectory of American Zionism is well, I'll give you two options. I'll give you what I think will happen, and then I will give you what I would hope might happen, because those I think are two very different visions. What I think what might happen is that American Zionism may become increasingly insular and niche, only because, as Dov suggested, if these other alternatives for Jewish politics take off in a way that, you know, certainly they've become compelling to millennials, but perhaps, you know, to more broadly, generationally, then American Zionism is going to find itself increasingly restricted to religious Zionists, perhaps even to some Haredim, even though the Haredi community or the ultra-Orthodox community has traditionally been anti-Zionist, but I think there may be compelling political and economic reasons why this may become more important. And then also that form of economic Zionism changing from kind of a passive philanthropic Zionism to the cost of Jewish life has gotten so high in the United States for this group of people that they've become something more of an active Zionism than immigration out of economic interest. But I think that it will become restricted more to Orthodox Jewry, especially if the trend continues where there's an accelerating conflict in the identity politics space between Zionism and progressivism. That will certainly mean that that a lot of liberal and progressive Jews will need to make tough choices about where they stand, because it will no longer be possible to hold both of these values and to remain in this space as a Zionist. So I think that also will change. And along with it, the forms of allyship that American Zionists will have may also change, because no longer may they necessarily be in kind of traditional partnerships with progressive forces, but I think they more likely may find themselves in allyship with evangelical Christians, which Dov, I think, can say quite a lot about as being sort of the dominant force of American Zionism going forward, as well as other more conservative or Republican Party aligned forces. So that's what I think may happen. What I would like to see happen is that American Zionists might be in conversation with other diaspora Zionist communities. You know, America is not an island, although it sometimes likes to think of itself so, and to try and I think learn from other diasporas who are having, I think, a more active conversation with the state of Israel in terms of have moved beyond, as Dov said, the kind of Israel right or wrong model, where they are speaking much more forcefully about the impact of Israel's activities on their lives abroad, and also to learn from other models that diaspora Zionist communities have embraced in terms of engaging younger generations, in terms of having a more productive communal conversation, and generally being able to speak across both across the ocean to Israel, but also amongst themselves in a less polarized fashion than the conversation on Israel has been, and where I see it going. So I hope that American Zionists might also think about talking to other groups of Zionists in other places.
Thank you so much for that. I have to say that was a bit of a dim outlook. It made me a little sad, but thank you. Dov, could you please share your thoughts on the future of Zionism?
I wish I could offer a more upbeat and optimistic assessment, but I fully agree with Sarah's prognosis. I think the likelihood is that the current trends continue, which is, of course, is always a caveat. Things could change. Sara mentioned already rising concerns about anti-Semitism. I don't personally think that is likely to lead to a kind of, new embrace of Zionism among progressive secular Jews. I think, like Sara said, that the likelihood is that Zionism will become the increasing concern of the religious conservatives, both religious conservatives within the American Jewish community, that is, as Sara was saying, the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox, and obviously religious conservatives in American society at large, evangelical Christians particularly. I mean, the future of Zionism in the United States is likely to be shaped first and foremost by Christian Zionists, who are much more numerous than Jewish Zionists. But I think for American Jewish Zionism, as Sara said, the likelihood is that the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox will remain wedded to their forms of Zionism, while secular liberal American Jews will, I think, move away from it in growing numbers. And I think part of this is the real challenge of the survival, if you like, of liberal Zionism, really, which is really, that has been the preferred form of Zionism for secular Jewish liberals, a way of, and as Sara said, there is this tension, and now the concerns about being excluded from progressive spaces if you're a Zionist. So I think that is the likelihood. Unless, of course, there is some sort of shock to the system, be it anti-Semitism, which I think is interesting. Even with the rising concerns of anti-Semitism, you haven't actually seen a kind of renewed emphasis on Zionism or Israel as a safe haven, partly because I think there's a recognition that the existence of a Jewish state hasn't solved or ended anti-Semitism. And if anything, as Sara mentioned, the most threatened Jewish community in the world today exists in the Jewish state, is in Israel. But I think, aside from these kinds of external shocks, the likelihood is that Zionism won't disappear by any means, but it will be one of many, of a few ideologies or beliefs. It certainly won't be the glue that has held the American Jewish community together over the last few decades.
Thank you so much for that. So I think we're going to pivot to questions. I see that we have 2 already. So I am going to start here, and then if people want to jump in, you can just use your little raise hand icon and we will get to you. So our first question is from Jonathan Camel, and it says, is there a vision of American Zionism that can include a binational state or confederation, essentially cultural Zionism that is not only state-based?
Shall I answer that? Yeah, I mean, I actually think, so Sara was mentioning one option to kind of save American Zionism, if you like, or at least prevent it from becoming a kind of minority affair, is to look to other Jewish communities in the diaspora. And I absolutely, as you probably have gathered, I come originally from one of those communities, so I absolutely do think American Jews should look to other Jewish communities as well. But I think one of the keys actually is to broaden our understanding of Zionism. I think, as I kind of alluded to in my opening remarks in saying that there was many different varieties of Zionism and many different versions of Zionism, but it kind of got narrowed into one understanding of Zionism, political Zionism, one understanding that to be a Zionist means supporting a Jewish state, and a Jewish state is understood meaning a state in which Jews predominate, the majority of the population. I think actually, if people were to recognize that there are many different varieties of Zionism, including a cultural Zionism that puts less emphasis upon Jewish statehood, I think actually that could revitalize Zionism by understanding that it isn't just simply identification with the state of Israel, that it's fundamentally about the importance of having a thriving Jewish community in the land of Israel. Now, for political Zionists, that involves statehood, but there was even different ways of thinking about Jewish statehood. And, so when it comes to, say, the idea of a confederation between Israel and Palestine, which I personally support, I absolutely think, first of all, confederation is a version of the two-state solution. It's not sometimes set up as opposed to one, but I absolutely think that that is compatible with a certain understanding of Zionism. So I think we need to recognize that we need to accept a plurality of Zionisms and not insist that every American Jew subscribe to one single form of Zionism, which entails support for a Jewish majority state as presently constituted in Israel.
Thank you. Sarah, did you have anything to add on that question?
Yeah, I guess I'd just say that I agree with Dov, that I assume that, both Dov and I probably teach classes on the history of Zionism at our respective universities. And I imagine that, most American Jews would get an F in our class on day one, because they would not be able to identify the different streams of Zionism that have competed against each other historically and, in the contemporary period. And that there is, a much more capacious definition of Zionism that is possible, and certainly actually previously existed prior to the state of Israel, when these ideas were extremely hotly contested. And it was, as Dov says, only in the end that kind of a Herzlian Zionism or a political Zionism really won out over other alternatives. I guess I would quibble and say I see binationalism as more of a vision of a Buberian Zionism, kind of a Martin Buber idea of Zionism, a kind of humanistic Zionism, than a cultural Zionism, which I associate more broadly with, say, its earliest exponent being Moghadam, the idea of a kind of Jewish renaissance, that Zionism will be Israel will be the spiritual center of Jewry, but not necessarily their physical home or even a place of even a sovereign community. And we can see that today, that Israel has become the great laboratory of Judaism, and there are books being written about, the Israeli Jewish century and what that means. So we could see those visions returning. I guess the question for me about binationalism, which might be a little bit different from confederation, is that going to remain a Zionist vision? Because you could have a binational state where both Palestinian nationalism and Zionism, Jewish nationalism, are honored and have their respective places within that political organization. But you could also have a binationalism which does not necessarily function in that way. So I guess it depends on really where nationalism sits in those visions. I think it's a little bit easier to see that maybe in confederation than it is in binationalism, which historically, Martin Buber and his allies didn't really provide a really great blueprint for. We couldn't go back to Martin Buber's writings and somehow, figure out what a binational state would look like. And today, the idea of binationalism has been more co-opted by those who believe in a state for all of its citizens that is based more on demography than on ideology. So I guess it would really depend what that looks like. But I definitely agree with Dov that there's a lot of room for a greater understanding of Zionism. And I think it's quite a shame, really, that a lot of our American Jewish leadership would fail the classes that Dov and I give every semester, because there are many alternatives we just don't hear in the American Jewish or the American Zionist conversation about what Zionism was and what Zionism could be.
Can I just jump in, just quickly respond to something that Sarah said, because I didn't mention kind of a Zionist binationalism. That essentially, I think, a Zionist binationalism is not is not the same as a state for all its citizens or simply a one-state solution. It requires the recognition of Jewish national rights, that Jews are a collective, a nation, and that they have national rights in Israel, Palestine, in the land of Israel. How those national rights, and the binational from that also Palestinians are a nation and have national rights. So the idea is that you have two national communities which are explicitly recognized in some sort of binational state and have national rights in that, whether it be autonomy in certain areas like education. I don't personally think that's really workable, but that is the idea. And I think the very fact that people are now discussing binationalism again, and there is a slight interest in this, shows, I think, the degree to which people are beginning to think outside of the box that they thought in for a long time, which said, no, it's not, if it's got to be a Jewish state, or that's not Zionism.
Thank you. Is there anybody that wanted to ask a question verbally? Otherwise, I'll continue down our list. Okay, David.
Hi, Dov. Hi, Sarah. You guys are providing really refreshing discussion. So thank you for coming on this and being able to answer some questions. we just got done with IPF with a book club discussion on Spies of No Country by Mati Friedman. And I want to bring up a quote that Mati has in the book, which is, Israel in this century makes sense only through a Middle Eastern lens, which is one that Westerners find it harder and harder to figure out. He goes on to say in an interview with the Times of Israel, I came from the West with European stories of Israel, the kibbutz, the Holocaust. The longer you're here, though, the more you realize those stories don't fully represent Israel. Half the country came from the Muslim world, and that informs everything about Israel from cuisine, behavior, music, religion, and politics. So my question is, how does the makeup of Israel today and the fact that it's a Middle Eastern country in a Middle Eastern region play into the disconnect between American Jews and Israel? Thanks.
Who would you like to?
I could start with you, Dov.
Okay, yeah, great question. And I think it absolutely does play into it. I think, really this shift dates back obviously to the era of mass emigration to Israel in the 1950s. I mean, Zionism was a European project to save European Jews, but most of them were murdered in the Holocaust. And so the demographics of the state of Israel grew primarily heavily from the Middle East and North Africa. And I think, for many years, there was this kind of disconnect between how Jews in the United States and in some European countries thought of Israel and imagined Israel and the Israel that they thought of and the actual Israel. And I think as American Jews have gradually become a little bit more familiar with the actual Israel by visiting it or watching it on television, at least, they realize that indeed, as you said, it is a Middle Eastern country. And in many ways, its politics, it reflects that in some ways. So I think absolutely part of the kind of gap between, the divide between American Jews and Israel is the fact that it is in that culturally, politically, it is different. And that you cannot, it's not just like a little outpost of Europe or a social democracy on the shores of the Mediterranean. No, actually, it is, a different kind of country. And that's one that for some kind of particularly older generation of Jews in the diaspora, they've struggled to really accept that. And I think there's a certain degree of Orientalism or even racism that may underlie that in the kind of, discomfort with recognizing Israel as a Middle Eastern country. And of course, Israeli leaders themselves haven't really embraced Israel's Middle Easternness until, at least until they could make, trade agreements with Gulf countries.
Yeah, I think I agree with Dov that, the American Jewish community has been kind of slow to recognize that Israel today is essentially what we would call in the United States a majority-minority country. And maybe this is partially because of, some of the, new survey data that we have, even though the Ashkenazi Jewish community in the United States remains dominant today, somewhere between 8 and 10% of American Jews are now affiliating as Jews of color. And that, may change perceptions in the United States and see, more affiliation with Israel, people that look like us, people who came from backgrounds that are more like our own. And that's, certainly different for American Jews. I think, what Madi is leading to is very important because it also suggests that we can't impose our American understanding of the color line and of race onto Israel, that, this isn't the same conflict that is going on here. And we can't just sort of pick up the rubrics and the frameworks that we have, let's say, I'll say as a shorthand kind of wokeness and apply them to Israel so neatly. But at the same time, I think there is also a question here about the agenda behind some of this discussion. To point this out and say, yes, let's look at the demography of Israel today. Let's look at the makeup of Israeli culture, of Israeli politics. That has changed significantly. I think where it becomes more of a question is maybe of a distraction from another discussion about Zionism that does need to happen, which is the discussion that we are having about Israel as a settler colonial state. What are the differences between Israel's form of settler colonialism and other kinds of settler colonialism? or the image that Israel has had of itself, not only because up until recently it has been an Ashkenazi elite that has dominated politics, and I will stress very carefully here that I don't think Ashkenazi is the same as white, so I'm not trying to make that parody, but I would say that the Ashkenazi elite also has seen Israel as a kind of villa bajungle, the idea that it's sort of this colonial outpost in the midst of, you know, a sea of the other. And when this, you know, trope is deployed that Israel today is part of the Middle East, is very important, but it shouldn't be deployed kind of as a distraction from addressing some of these larger important questions to Israel's existence, to the future of Zionism, and frankly, to the future of American Zionist relationship with Israel. So it really depends on how we're using those discussions, I guess. But it's a great book. I enjoyed reading it too. I read it on airplane in one sitting back in the day in COVID, before, like when we used to like fly places and do things.
Thank you so much. That was a great question. I enjoyed the book as well. It was a great book club discussion. There was a great question here, and I wanted to pose Jason Berkovich's question. How does a general lack of religious affiliation among younger American Jews factor into how young American Jews think of Zionism and Israel? If anyone wants to jump in and go first, otherwise.
Yeah, I'll start. I mean, I think there is kind of like a wag the dog phenomenon that goes on between religious affiliation and also religious education, or just generally Jewish education. It doesn't necessarily have to be in, you know, observant values, and Zionism. That because I mean, you know, I think the appreciation of the Zionist idea often comes from a larger understanding of Jewish history and Jewish values and Jewish narratives. So I think that the lack of religious affiliation and certainly, you know, consequently engagement in institutional Jewish life or education or other kinds of forms of Jewish socialization that were really extremely prevalent, you know, in our grandparents' generation. In part of my research from my book, you know, I was looking at the affiliation of some of the people who actually ended up becoming settlers. But I think it gives us a snapshot into the 1960s generation that not only do they say that, you know, they had, you know, Jewish education, they kept kosher in their homes, they may have had some kind of observance of the Sabbath or other kinds of rituals. But I think the most important thing that they said was that most of their other friends were Jewish, and they were informed in all kinds of Jewish institutional and lay life. And that just isn't necessarily characteristic of the American Jewish experience today. You know, ourselves or many of our friends and students, certainly the students that Dov and I teach, in many ways have a more, you know, cosmopolitan and less insular upbringing than previous generations. And, you know, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, that's just a truism and will reflect on the trajectory of American Zionism.
Shall I add on to that? Yeah, so I agree with what Sara was saying. I would just say, it's interesting because I think historically in the 60s and 70s and 80s, maybe this is slightly departs from what Sara was saying, that Zionism was most useful for secular American Jews, for the less religious. Actually, the religious Jews don't need a substitute for Judaism. They have Judaism. They have a strong source of their Jewish identity, and that's expressed through, you know, they can do Jewish by performing mitzvot and by studying Torah and things like that. It's secular American Jews who gave up their Judaism for whom Zionism was most valuable. It was because it was essentially a kind of substitute Judaism, a way of being Jewish for them who no longer wanted to, you know, observe Torah or practice the Jewish law. I think where we're seeing today is this shift from where Zionism was most meaningful to the secular Jews to now, but Zionism is becoming increasingly the province of the more religious and less meaningful to the secular. One interesting thing in the, you know, in the recent Pew reports that have come out on showing the changes in the American Jewish community, the fastest growing groups in the American Jewish community today are the Orthodox, which includes the ultra-Orthodox, and those who say they are the so-called nuns, who do not identify with any religion. They identify as Jews, but not as a religion. And so you see this growth, particularly among younger Jews, millennials, who are more likely to say they have no religion, the so-called nuns. And that's also the group that is less less attached to Israel and more likely to be critical. So absolutely, there is a very intimate connection between the decline of progressive non-Orthodox streams of Judaism, the abandonment, if you like, of Jewish practices and rituals that's gradually happening, and the fact that increasingly Jews aren't joining Jewish institutions or synagogues, etc., and also the attenuation of Zionism, if you like. And that's why I think it is, the future really lies with those religious conservatives, both Jewish religious conservatives and Christian religious conservatives.
Thank you. I think we have time for one final question, if it's kind of a quickie, if anyone has one they'd like to ask. Okay.
Don't be shy. Now's your moment.
Yeah.
Jump in. I'll say,
Oh, yeah, please go ahead.
yeah, is there a modern or contemporary Zionist thinker to maybe dispel some of this gloom? Is there one that inspires you?
Thank you for that.
Okay, I think, well, I don't think that this is a period of great kind of Zionist thought. I think partly that's because the focus has been on kind of advocacy and philanthropy and not on the intellectual kind of continued development. There is an Israeli academic, political theorist called Chaim Gans, who authored a book called A Just Zionism. And I highly recommend that, because I think if you're struggling with how you can reconcile support for Zionism with the idea of Palestinian rights and recognizing also the historic impact that Zionism has had upon the Palestinian people, I think that is the best articulation philosophically of what I would call, kind of, for want of a better word, a liberal Zionist perspective. So he is somebody I would encourage, but actually I think, unfortunately, there is a real, and this is a topic for another day, but I think there is a serious decline in the quality of intellectual discourse in the American Jewish community, partly because the ways in which it's funded and the organizations and the outlets. So there isn't really a serious place for addressing and discussing these things. And instead we just have these kind of, a very facile anti-Zionism that's sometimes expressed, and an equally facile and simplistic Zionism that's expressed, and it's a dialogue of the deaf, obviously.
I think we are about to be shut out of our rooms, but I wanted to take a quick moment to thank everybody for joining us, especially